Creature capturing coders, it's Professor Gallagher, and in this lesson we're going to use our Poke API to get page after page of Pokemon as we scroll. Once we're looking at the last Pokemon that we've downloaded, if there are more creatures available, we'll load the next page of 20, and we'll do that until we've caught them all. Ready to learn big? Let us continue to hack. So we've got this nice list of Pokemon that we've downloaded as our first page of JSON, and if we click on a Pokemon, we see some details on that creature and a creature image. Now, before we download our next page of Pokemon, one thing that would be nice is if we numbered our Pokemon so that we can tell how many we have loaded so far. So I'd like to modify the string we're using in our navigation links label and add a number in front of it. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to know the number of our Pokemon because the list view is iterating through an array, and when we do this, we don't use an index value. So we have our creatures array here, and each individual element is a creature, but we don't have any sort of count or index value. Well, we can actually change this, and instead we can iterate through a range instead of iterating on an array, and we can use that range as the index number for each of our Pokemon. Let's do that together now. First, I'm going to highlight creaturesVM.creaturesArray, and I'm going to backspace to delete this, and I'm going to replace that with 0 ... less than symbol creaturesVM.creaturesArray.count. So now we've got a range in here, just like we would if we were to do a for in loop. Now currently this is going to start with 0, and in our current example, it's going to end at 19, so it's not going to go up to 20, which is creaturesArray.count, because we've got ... less than symbol, our half-open range. Then we need to replace creature as the name of the value we're iterating over with, how about we call this index, since it's going to be an index, and this is going to be an int now instead of a creature struct. And now we've got to modify our navigation link value, so we use this index value in here. In the detail view, we're no longer passing in a creature, so we're going to pass to the detail view creaturesVM.creatureArray bracket index close bracket. It's the same thing we were passing through before, it's just now we're accessing it with an index. We've got to write more code here, but it's going to give us access to the number that's our index value, and we can use that to put out front of our Pokemon. And I want to reuse this, so I'm going to highlight creaturesVM.creaturesArray bracket index bracket and copy it, and then in the text field for the label down below, I'm going to highlight creature and paste over what I just copied, creaturesVM.creatureArray bracket index bracket. I'm going to keep the .name and .capitalize after this. Again, same thing, we're just using indices now, but now let's put the index number out front. So just inside this text view, I'm going to create a string with double quotes and put a string interp inside that'll hold my Pokemon number using the index. But first, I'm going to put creaturesVM.creatureArray bracket index bracket .name .capitalize inside a string interp. Make sure you got the closing double quote at the end. Then in this first string interp, I'll put in index, but since we're 0 indexed and I want to start counting at 1, I'm going to say index plus 1, and I'm going to put a period just outside this first string interp so I get a period after the number. Make sure you got a space after that. And will you look at that? We've got our creature index numbered starting at 1 through our last creature, which is 20. Now, before we get our next page of Pokemon, let's also add a toolbar at the bottom that will show how many creatures we've downloaded and how many total creatures we have. And we can do this really easily. So I'm going to do this as another modifier for the list just after our navigation title. Here I'll say .toolbar. I'll select this. I've got content in here, but I'll press return. That'll give me the trailing closure format, and in between the curlies, then I enter a toolbar item view, and I select this option with the content. I should have added a placement parameter in here, but I can do that in just a bit. I'll press return for the trailing closure format here as well, but I'm going to add a placement parameter in here. So just before the opening curly of the toolbar item, I'll put in parentheses and then type in placement : and in here I'm going to say look at my options in here, I'm going to select bottom toolbar, so this will create a bottom toolbar. Then in the parentheses for this toolbar item, I'm just going to enter a text view, so no button or anything like that, and inside the text view I'm going to pass in with double quotes string interp of string interp creatures. And in the first string interp, I'll say creaturesVM.creaturesArray.count, so that'll tell me how many creatures I've downloaded. And in the second string interp, I'll enter creaturesVM.count. Now you might remember from an earlier lesson, and if you don't, this is the number we got from our API call. We parsed that out of the JSON, and it's the total number of Pokemon that are available. So at the time that I'm recording this video, that number is 1154. So let's take a look over here on the right, and look at that! We can see we've got 20 of 1154 Pokemon downloaded. Excellent! So now it's time to load up our next page of Pokemon. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, If we scroll and we end up looking at the very last Pokemon in our creatures array, then we want to go ahead and download the next page of Pokemon if another page is available. Now remember, if we're looking at our JSON, this key here named next has the URL for the next page of 20 Pokemon. When do we want to get our next page of Pokemon? Well, if we've loaded and we're looking at the last element in the creatures array, that would be creaturesvm.creaturesarray.last. That'll get the last element. So when the element of the array appears and we see this last element, then we're ready to call getData again, and we do that using the next value, which is the URL of the next page of 20 Pokemon. So here's where we've used the URL in next to load the second page of data. See how this next page starts with Spearow, and then if we scroll down to the last Pokemon on this page, then we call getData using the next URL on this page. This loads the next page of creatures that starts with Zubat. Scroll to the end of this next 20, and then when we hit that last creature, we call getData again. We load the next page of Pokemon using this URL. That'll give us a page that starts with Poliwhirl, and we do this over and over again until we've loaded all the pages. Now, one thing to remember is when we wrote getData, we actually updated the URL string with the next value that's on the current page of Pokemon. Remember that URL string? This is what we use to turn into a URL value, and we use this to call the URL session. So we've already got the next value in URL string, so all we need to do is call getData. Now, there's also one really important thing to remember. We need to update this creatures array by adding the new results array to the end of the current creatures array. If we don't do that, we don't make this change, then we just replace one page with another. I've seen lots of students forget to do this update, and they're wondering why they're not showing all of their data in their app. So cool, this seems like it'll work. Now we keep calling getData each time we look at the last element in our creatures array, but when do we know we don't have any more data left? Well, if you were to click away at the URL in next for page after page, this would actually be the second to last page of data that's available. And this one right here would be the last page. And do you see what we have in the next value on this last page? It's not a valid URL. It's null. And we said in an earlier lesson that null is JSON speak for nil, or an absence of value. Now we are going to run into an issue when we hit null on this very last page. And that's because our JSON is expecting to decode a string, not a null. So I mentioned in the last lesson, we should have set our string for the next value here to an optional string, not just a string. But I didn't make that change right away because I want you to see the error. It's really common to encounter this when you decode JSON and you don't realize that you might get a null value instead of a value that you're expecting. So we'll show that error at the end of the lesson and we'll show you how to fix it. But for now, let's see how we can code up our app to load page after page of data as we scroll. First, we know that we can use the onAppear modifier to fire when a view appears, but there's one tricky aspect to using this in SwiftUI. We can't use this on a navigation link inside of a list. onAppear on a list won't fire when we see one element at a time, but there is a way around this. If we put a lazy V stack inside the list and around our navigation link, then when we call onAppear on the lazy V stack, since the lazy V stack only loads rows one at a time when it needs them, then we can be sure that when we call onAppear, we're actually calling it when the row we're looking at has appeared on screen. So the first thing that we'll do is add a lazy V stack around our navigation link like this. Then we'll add an onAppear to the lazy V stack, and in onAppear, we're going to look at the last element in our creatures array. That's this value last creature that we're creating with the if-let statement below. Now, once we have the last creature in the array, we're going to compare it to the current array element that we're looking at, which is this value here, creaturesvm.creaturesarray at index. And we actually compare the .name properties of these two values since each Pokemon has a unique name. So if they're equal, then we know we're looking at the same thing. So if that's true, that means that the Pokemon that loaded at the index value of index is also the last creature in the creatures array. So that means we're looking at the last creature that we loaded, so we should call getData and load more JSON. But we only want to do this if the URL string has a valid URL, not if it's null, remember? Because if it's null, that means there are no more pages of Pokemon left to load. We've loaded the last page of JSON. So here I check to see if the URL string begins with, or has a prefix of, HTTP. That wouldn't be the case if we get a null value for the next value. So if this is no longer true, then we must be looking at the last page of JSON data. So this will make sure that we never call getData if we have no more pages of data left, and we're done. So let's code this up and see if it works. So in our creatures list view, first, let's embed the navigation link in a lazy V stack. So I'm going to command click on the navigation link to pull up the quick action menu. And there's no embed in lazy V stack, but I'll just select embed in V stack, and then I'll add the word lazy out front. And then I'll command A, control I to fix the indents. Now in live preview, this doesn't seem to change the way the app executes at all, but it will let us detect when one row at a time appears. So we do this to make sure that we can properly use the onAppear modifier. So we'll add .onAppear below the close and curly of the lazy V stack, and in between onAppear's curlies, we're going to check to see if we've loaded the last element in the creatures array. So I'll first use an if-let statement to get the last element in the creatures array. I do that with if-let, we'll call this last creature, equals creatures vm.creaturesArray.last. And we're in an if-let because last might return a nil. See the optional up here? That'll only happen if we don't have any elements in the creatures array, but we do need to unwrap the returned element since it is an optional and we want a straight up creature type. So by using if-let, we make sure that we don't have a nil in here, and if we don't have nil, that we unwrap the value. And in here, we'll check to see if the element at the index that we've loaded, so first we'll say if creatures vm.creaturesArray bracket index bracket, and we're going to compare names, so I'm going to add .name to the end of this. Then we'll say equals equals to compare this to last creature.name. That's the last creature in our creatures array that we got in this line above. Now, not only do we want to make sure this is true before we load more data, but we also want to create a compound conditional. We also need to check to make sure that we've got a page of data to load. So we're going to say ampersand, ampersand. That creates an and for a compound conditional. Two things need to be true. And we're going to check to see if creaturesvm.url string.has prefix, and then we're going to pass in the string HTTP open and close curlies. So if both these things are true, then we should call getData. Now, in order to call getData inside the onAppear statement, I need to do one thing. I'm going to wrap my call to getData in a task, capital T, open and close curlies. I need to do this because I'm about to call an async function. Now, if we look down here where we called getData the first time when we loaded our first page of JSON, we did this using a special task modifier, but we're already inside of an onAppear modifier, so we can't call .task inside of this. But we can say capital T task. This is pretty much the same thing. We're saying, hey, we're about to make an asynchronous function call. Now, we're still going to put await out front, so I'm just going to copy this whole line here, this await getData call that we'd previously made, and then I'm going to paste it up in between the tasks curlies in my onAppear modifier above, and this should work great. But there's one more thing we need to do. I mentioned I see lots of students make this mistake, and frankly, I forget to do this quite a bit too, but I've come into this error so many times that I usually recognize it right away. We need to make one modification in our getData function call in our creatures view model. So let's head over there, and inside our getData method, find the do clause. And you see this line here where we say self.creaturesArray equals return.results? Well, this will stamp over anything in self.creaturesArray with the results we've just returned. And we don't want to replace creaturesArray with the new returned results. We want to add the returned results to the creaturesArray. So we just say self.creaturesArray equals self.creaturesArray plus return.results. Then we can head back to creatures list view. And if I scroll in live preview, watch what happens as the 20th Pokemon appears. Now, before I do that, see the toolbar down below says 20 Pokemon? Scroll up, and oh! Now I see I've got 40 Pokemon, and I can see the next page of JSON data has loaded, starting with that creature named Spearow. Ultra cool! Now, I could scroll through all the pages in live preview, but as I mentioned, I want to show you a very common error, and since I want to see the error message printed to the console, I need to build and run in the simulator. Now, it's also useful to run in the simulator because scrolling in a list for some reason is smoother in the simulator than it is in live preview. So now I'm viewing my app, and I'm going to keep scrolling, and we see page after page of Pokemon is loading, the number of creatures is updating in the toolbar down below, and we can see in the console in the back that we're calling URL after URL. Remember, we print the URL we're about to call with a spiderweb emoji out front just before we call URL session, so this is useful. But notice what happens when I get to the very last screen of Pokemon data. I can't load that last page. See, I stopped, for me, this is at Pokemon number 1140, but I have 1154 total Pokemon. So what gives? Well, our clue is the angry emoji we see in the console. Now, this error message that I wrote says that we weren't able to properly decode our JSON data. What went wrong? Well, we can take a look at the code in our creatures view model, and actually before we do that, why don't we highlight and copy the last URL that we called just before we got this error? We'll just grab this in the console. Remember I said it would be really useful for debugging to print out each URL before we make the API call? So here's that tip in action. And so as I copy this, I'll head to the browser, paste it in, and take a look at this JSON. We see the next value here doesn't return a valid string. It returns a null, but we're not decoding this value into a value that can hold a null. Remember, a null is a nil in Swift. We're decoding this into a straight up string. So we got the JSON error because we tried to decode a nil value into a variable that can only hold a string. If you ever see JSON errors like this, that happens when we try to decode JSON data into a set of Swift structures and properties that aren't set up to hold the JSON that we're getting back. So the problem here is our returned structure, that doesn't match the JSON we're getting. So let's change this and instead decode this into a string question mark or an optional string. Whoops, and so sorry, we were just looking at the creature's detail view model. Although our getData function is the same, we need to head over to our creature's view model. And remember, in a previous lesson, we put a comment in here that said this should really be an optional. Well, now we've proven why. Again, the reason is on the very last page of JSON data. Now, we wouldn't have known that until we went and looked at all of those pages of JSON data. We get a null in here, which is going to return a nil. Now, sometimes an API documentation will clearly state this. Other times, this might just not show up until you go ahead and do some user testing. But fortunately, the fix for this is pretty easy. All we need to do is put a question mark after string. This will allow us to get back not just strings, but also null values. But we need to remember now we're putting this inside of an optional value. So down here where we set returned.next to self.url string, we'll use nil coalescing with question mark, and I'll put an empty string after this. That means if we can safely unwrap return.next into a string, we'll put the string in URL string, but if we get a nil value, we'll just put an empty string into URL string. Either way, since our returned.next property is now an optional string, we're not going to get the JSON decoding error. So I've obviously launched the app in the simulator, and I'm scrolling and scrolling until I hit the last page. I'll speed things up for you, and here I am about to scroll to that last page, and we should now not see a JSON error in the console, and we should see the last page of Pokemon loading. And there we have it. 1154 of 1154 Pokemon loaded. This last guy that we see here in my list of Pokemon is Enamorous Therian. Apologize to the Pokefans if I pronounce this wrong. Confession, I'm actually not that into Pokemon myself, but I've got 3 kids, so through osmosis, I've learned about this stuff. I've watched my fair share of TV shows. So, this is fantastic, Swifter. You've gained a pretty significant skill loading and decoding JSON page after page as you scroll. And hopefully you also feel good about learning additional tips like detecting and diagnosing JSON errors and how to fix them. Now, if you click on some of those later Pokemon, you might see that you don't see an image showing up for them. That's because those particular Pokemon don't use the front default URL that we grabbed in our prior lesson, but we'll learn how to fix this in a future lesson. For now, bask in the Swiftacular skills that you've acquired, and do me a solid, like and subscribe, tell your friends, classmates, and professors about this YouTube series. Everyone is welcome to use my content in their classes, but I want to hear from folks that find this useful. More lessons coming up next. Continue to hack.